Good day, students. I'm your tutor for Economics 1, EC10D2. My name is Ruth Egunjobi, your tutor, and I'll be taking you through the course as well as the tutorial letter for 2018. This course has learning outcomes. In other words, at the end of this course, what are the things, the competencies you should have achieved? You need to be able to explain consumers' reaction to changes in price. You need to be able to describe the impact of government policy on the economy. And you also need to be able to estimate the national income of a country using both approaches, that is the income approach and the expenditure approach. And you need to get yourself a good economic textbook, and I recommend Mankiw, The Principles of Economics, the 7th edition, 2014, or John Sloman, Essentials of Economics, the 6th edition, 2013. Any other book would also do as long as you read up the course contents. The tutorial guide, don't forget the importance of referencing. Referencing is very important when answering an assignment. Write properly, in other words, write logically, answer the questions. At the end of this presentation, I'll give you more tips on how to present your answers. And don't forget to use diagrams as needed. This is economics, and economics has to do with the theories, it has to do with some calculation, and it has to do with diagrams as well. Okay, let's start with the course outline. Let me take you through the course outline as it was given to you in the tutorial letter. The first point here is the introduction. And in the introduction to this course, which is a second-year course, it's a second-year course, but it's the first time you're going to see most of these concepts. You need to understand what economics is all about. And some key concepts, like the concept of opportunity cost, want, scarcity, needs. Another concept are the factors of production, which are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Economic systems, the production possibility curve, the basic difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics. And the second point, the theory of demand and supply. The third point, the theory of consumer behavior. The fourth point, the theory of production and costs, the theory of production. Then market structures, macroeconomic issues and measurement, fiscal and monetary policy, money, international trade, and finally, exchange rate mechanisms. So these 10 points constitute the course outline for the degree EC10D2. And I'll quickly take you through the course outline before we come back to the tutorial later. What is the course all about? We call it economics. It's a social science and deals with what? The production, the distribution, consumption of goods and services. And it also attempts to explain how wealth is being created and distributed in communities. In other words, how people allocate resources that are scarce and which have many alternative uses. On one hand, we have scarcity of resources. We all say resources are limited. On the other hand, our needs or our wants are unlimited. And economics is therefore the study of how consumers, how we react to these shortage of resources within the economy, and how we can make sure we always make the rational decision in the face of limited resources. Now we have to define what want is and need. Like I said earlier, it's a constant struggle between limited resources and unlimited wants. What is a want? Goods that are not really necessary. We can say that goods or services that are not necessary, but what we desire or wish for. Just like we all need clothes, but we all want clothes, but we don't need designer clothes. On the other hand, needs are goods or services that are required, and this would actually talk about the need of food, the basic needs of life: food, shelter, clothing, and healthcare. That is want and need. Scarcity is another thing which I would like you to read up, but I want to talk about opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is a benefit a person could have received but gave up in order to take another course of action. Stated differently, an opportunity cost represents an alternative given up when a decision is made. Since we cannot have everything we wish for, then we have to make decisions. And the decision you make always has to do with something you gave up. Therefore, the cost of an item or a good is the alternative you did not take. And that is what opportunity cost is all about. In economics, opportunity cost is very important. Another concept, the factors of production. And this is an economic term which basically describes the inputs that are used in the production of goods and services in order to make an economic profit. And what are these factors? Land, which the reward is rent; labor, the reward for that is wages; capital, the reward for capital is interest; and entrepreneurship, the reward for entrepreneurship is profit. Economic system is another point in the introduction. What is an economic system? This refers to the means by which countries and governments distribute resources and trade goods and services. And economic systems could be a free market economy, whereby the forces of demand and supply are left to operate freely. It could be a command economic system, such as we have in socialism and communism, or it could be mixed, which is a combination of the two. Namibia has a mixed economic system. Now we come to microeconomics. We've looked at the broad meaning of what economics is all about. We begin to streamline it a bit into what microeconomics is. Economics is divided into two broad sections: the micro aspect and the macro. What therefore is microeconomics? From the word small. This is the study of economics at an individual, group, or company level. On the other hand, macroeconomics is the study of the whole national economy, looking at big issues like inflation, unemployment, poverty, balance of trade, deficits, and all that. This course is going to take us through the two branches of economics. We're going to start with the microeconomic aspect, then later move on to the macroeconomic concepts. We come across the PPF, a production possibility curve or frontier. You can see the diagram on the screen. A PPF illustrates the concept of opportunity cost. Opportunity cost I talked about earlier. This shows an economy given two goods. The economy can produce two goods, in this case, butter or guns. And the curve, points B, D, and C, shows us the combinations of both goods which are attainable. We can have more quantity of guns produced with less butter produced, point B, or we can have more butter produced, less guns produced at point C. Point A are underutilization of resources, and point X is unattainable. So the PPF, the production possibility frontier, shows the possible output combinations of two goods or services which an economy can achieve when all resources are fully and efficiently employed. This is a very interesting concept which you should take time to study. Now we go to the first point in the microeconomic aspect of the course outline, the theory of demand and supply. The theory of demand and supply is simple. It's basically the relationship between price and quantity demanded or quantity supplied. Now, the relationship between demand the theory of demand and supply has to do with how consumers react to changes in price. When the price of a commodity increases, the quantity demanded reduces. And that is the theory of demand. The relationship between demand and price, quantity demanded and price, is negative. If price increases, we demand less. On the other hand, the theory of supply illustrates the relationship between quantity supplied and price. When the price of a commodity is increasing, then you as a producer would actually supply more. That is why we have a positive relationship and a positive slope between supply and price. Now, there are determinants of the two. We have the determinants of demand and supply. On the other hand, we have determinants of quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Let me start with the first one. Determinants of demand, as you're going to see in the textbook. Why do we demand for anything? The demand for a commodity is a function of things other than the price, such as income, taste, or preferences. On the other hand, what determines quantity demanded? How much quantity of a good do I demand? That is a function or depends on the price of that commodity. On the other hand, what determines supply? What determines supply? The determinants of supply are things other than price, such as the climate, the weather, the cost, the factors of production and all that. But on the other hand, what determines quantity supplied? Quantity supplied is a function of price. In other words, how much I supply depends on how much price I can charge for it. Therefore, the demand and supply curves, there are a lot of movements along the curve. We can have a movement along the curve which is based on price, and we can have a shift in the curve which is based on factors other than price, like you see in these two curves. The first diagram here gives us the two conditions: demand, which is a negative slope, and the supply, which is a positive slope. On the diagram, you can see an increase in demand. You can see the price is constant at $2, but the demand curve shifts from D1 to D2. And this other diagram, we can see the supply, an increase in supply from S1 to S2. So this is a shift of the demand curve or the supply curve, but a shift along the demand or supply curve is as a result of changes in price. The other diagram here shows us the equilibrium position in the market at any point in time. Initially, we have D1, S1, equilibrium point 1. That is the initial position of the demand and supply in a market. What happens if we have an increase in demand from D1 to D2, and we have an increase in supply from S1 to S2? We can see that it affects quantity. There's an increase in quantity from Q1 to Q2. So the theory of demand has a lot to do with diagrams as well. And I want you to familiarize yourself and practice on how the equilibrium position changes when there's a change in price in the market, or there's a change, an increase or a decrease in the demand, or an increase or a decrease in the supply. This is very important. Now, the theory of demand and supply, the next thing is the elasticity. We need to know what the elasticity is. And what is elasticity in this context? This is a measure of the responsiveness of demand or supply to changes in price. In other words, how do customers react when there's a change in price? It could be elastic. In other words, the change in quantity demanded is greater than the change in price. A little change in price leads to a lot of consumers changing how much they initially wanted to buy. It could be inelastic. In other words, they're not really responsive to changes in price. Or it could be unitary. In other words, the change in price is equal to the change in quantity demanded or supplied, which is calculated to be 1. And elasticity has some formulas as well, which I want you to read in the text. Income elasticity of demand, cross elasticity of demand, price elasticity of demand. These are the 3 basic ones. And I want you to, the tutorial question has an assignment. The first assignment has to do with the calculation of elasticities, which you'll find interesting. Equilibrium conditions, like I talked about earlier, is also what we should look into before we leave the theory of demand and supply. The next point in the microeconomic aspect is the theory of consumer behavior. How do consumers behave? The first concept here is utility. Utility stands for satisfaction. Satisfaction derived from the consumption of a good or a service. And that many types of utility. You can have marginal utility, total utility, or average utility. The satisfaction consumers derive from consuming goods or services, and this is actually measurable. The law of diminishing marginal utility, indifference curve, and indifference map. Let me try to explain what an indifference curve is. An indifference curve is used to illustrate the concept of utility. It's a curve which shows the combination of 2 goods whereby a consumer is indifferent. 2 goods, A or B. I can consume good A or good B in different quantities as long as I remain along that curve. That curve shows a level of utility. Therefore, an indifference map is more than one level of utility. We can have so many maps on one diagram. That is an indifference map. We can also define that to be the locus of various points showing different combinations of 2 goods providing equal utility to the consumer. So the indifference curve illustrates the concept of utility. And the law of diminishing marginal utility, which states that as the consumer consumes more and more units of a specific commodity, the utility from successive units goes on diminishing. When you consume an item, the utility or the satisfaction initially is quite high, but as you keep on consuming that commodity, the satisfaction you derive is less than the previous one you got. So as you keep on consuming an item, the satisfaction reduces. And that is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Another concept in the theory of consumer behavior is a marginal rate of substitution. I talked about 2 goods. An indifference curve is like on an X and Y plane. The rate at which a consumer can give up some amount of one good in exchange for another while maintaining the same level of utility. That is a marginal rate of substitution. At this point, you don't need to go into the calculation of the marginal rate of substitution. That is beyond this course. But what is important at this stage is to be able to define and explain what you understand by the law of diminishing marginal utility and what you understand by the marginal rate of substitution. And another concept we need to remember here is the utility, the different types of utility. How do we calculate marginal utility? That's what we need to do in this course. How do we calculate total utility? And how do we calculate average utility? All these are in the texts, quite important. Here are some diagrams to illustrate that I talked about. The first one, total utility. As we increase the consumption of chocolate bars, the total utility increases at an increasing rate, gets to a maximum point at there about 5 bars. After the 5th bar of chocolate is consumed, the satisfaction the consumer derives begins to drop. You see the curve turning from that point, becoming negative, and it goes negative all the way till we can go to negative. We can see the other point, the other diagram on the right, the marginal utility, -5. We get to 0 and we begin to drop. In other words, each extra chocolate bar you consume becomes something you really don't want to do. And bananas and apples, the last diagram there, It's an indifference curve. If we consume more apples, we have to reduce the quantity of bananas we consume in order to remain on that curve. If we consume less apples, like 9 apples, then we can consume 41 bananas to be on point C. So that is an example of an indifference curve. Along that curve, a consumer is indifferent. He has the same level of satisfaction. Now, the theory of production and costs, which is the third point in the microeconomic aspect. Production basically refers to transforming inputs to outputs. And costs are the costs involved in the production process. Now, in the production theory, we have basic concepts like the total product, average and marginal of capital and labor. In production, we need 2 main components. And these 2 components are labor and capital. That's for the range of this course. We need labor and we need capital. Therefore, you're expected to be able to define and differentiate and calculate what total product of labor is, what total product of capital is. The same thing for marginal and average. Then we come to costs. Costs are those things involved in the production process, like I said earlier. And the cost also could be total, could be marginal, could be average, could be fixed, and could be variable. At this point, you need to be able to define and explain what these different costs are all about, and as well as a simple calculation in the form of a table, which is in the text as well, and also in the tutorial later. There's a table there that asks you to calculate the total cost, the marginal cost. Is a tabulated problem, which you should be able to do. And there are also graphs to that. We can plot all these graphs in an XY plane, on a single XY coordinate. And you're expected also to be able to present the table in a graph. Now, in the theory of production, we have the long run and the short run. In the long run, we say all the supply of inputs are very elastic. In other words, we can alter the production process to achieve what we want to do. But the short run is a period of production where the supply of inputs is very fixed. In other words, the supply of inputs is inelastic. We cannot really do much in the short run. So the production function is, as you can see, Q is a function of K and L. Q is a total product or output at any point in time. And output depends on labor and capital. Marginal product of labor is a change in output divided by the change in L, where you called labor constant. Graphical illustrations of what I talked about earlier. The first one is the TP, the total product. Its total product has an inclining slope, rising from 0 all the way. In other words, as we increase labor from one worker to the second worker to the third worker to the seventh worker to the 7th worker, when we employ the 7th worker, productivity is at maximum. If we employ the 8th worker, the 9th worker, the 10th worker, the output begins to drop. Therefore, the firm has to make a decision. How many workers do I need? How much labor do I need? And you can see the other diagram below that. You can see the AP, the average product is dropping, and the marginal product becomes negative. In other words, as you keep on employing labor, the productivity begins to decline. And the law of diminishing marginal productivity. This is not utility. This is the law of diminishing marginal returns, or otherwise called the law of diminishing marginal productivity, which states that as one input in the production of a commodity is increased, holding other inputs constant, a point will be reached at which additions of input yields progressively smaller or diminishing increases in output, like we saw in the diagram a minute ago. Then we come to returns to scale. In the theory of production, we also need to look into what returns to scale is all about. which refers to the rate at which output changes if all inputs are changed by the same factor. Returns to scale could be increasing, it could be decreasing. And at this point, you need to be able to define and explain what you understand by returns to scale, increasing returns to scale, or decreasing returns to scale. Market structures. In an economy, we have markets. A market is not a physical place whereby we say this is a physical market, but a market, we're talking about where the forces of demand and supply operate, is a market. Consumers on one hand make demands, suppliers on the other hand want to supply. So where we have those two conditions is a market. A market can be not necessarily a physical place, but that's what a market is all about. We have market structures in economics. And this table tries to summarize what it is all about. 4 basic types of market structures: the perfect market, perfect competitive market, a monopolistic market, a monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. In a market, there's a lot of competition. Competition between sellers. Everybody wants a share of the market. And we can see on the left-hand side, you can see under number of firms. In the perfect market, there's so many producers of that particular item. But in a monopolistic competitive market, it's just one producer, so he's monopolistic. In an oligopoly, there are many. In monopoly, there are few. And you can read the table: freedom of entry, nature of the product, the demand curve, the size of the firm, and all that. What is interesting, what is important at this point, after understanding the basic differences between the different market structures, you need to be able to understand how profit is maximized in these markets graphically. In other words, in a perfect market, we have a diagram that shows when is the market going to make a loss, or when is it making a profit. The same thing with monopoly. In a monopolistic market, when is the market in equilibrium, making a loss or making a profit? That is what we need to see. We need to practice graphically for the market structures, especially the perfect market and the monopoly and the monopolistic competitive market. You can leave out oligopoly. Oligopoly is not important at this point. But what we need to focus on is the perfect market, the monopolistic competition, and a monopoly situation. Then we come to the macro aspect of the course outline. We've covered the micro aspect in a nutshell. Let's look into the macroeconomic aspect of this course outline. The first thing is the macroeconomic issues and measurement. What are the issues we're looking at? The bigger issues. The first one is the GDP, which is the gross domestic product, and the GNP, the gross national product. National income accounting. We need to be able to compute. You need to be able to compute the GDP and the GNP. And we're going to do this using 2 approaches, the income approach and the expenditure approach. What is the expenditure approach? Where we add up all the expenditure in the economy. GDP is equals to C, as you can see on the screen. C is consumption. I stands for investment. G stands for government expenditure. Plus X minus M is import minus export. So we call that net export. Given data, and you're asked to compute the GDP of a country using the expenditure approach, this is what you're going to do. You add up all the consumption, you add up all the investment, you add up government expenditure, and you add the difference between imports and exports, which is the net exports. That's what give you the GDP via expenditure approach. Or the income approach, national income or the GDP is W, which is the wages, R, which is the rental from rental income, I, which is all the interest income, plus PR. PR is the profit. And that is the income approach. What is the GNP, the gross national product? Is C plus I plus G plus X minus M plus Z. What is Z? Z is foreign income from abroad. In other words, the net income earned by domestic residents from overseas investments. Net income earned by foreign residents from domestic investments. That is going to give us the GNP. And that's the two approaches to the computation of the national income. The second point in the macroeconomic aspect is the government macroeconomic policy. And this takes us to the fiscal and monetary policy, which are two tools whereby the government can stabilize an economy, boost the economy to the level of GDP consistent with full employment. These two tools are the fiscal and monetary policy. What is fiscal policy? It's the means whereby the government adjusts the spending levels, in other words, government's expenditure and tax rates, taxation, to control a country's economy. Monetary policy, on the other hand, through which the central bank of a country influences the nation's money supply. In other words, the Bank of Namibia can have a monetary policy to influence money supply. Now we're going to look into the tools of these two. Fiscal policy has two main tools: taxation or government expenditure. Monetary policy has a couple of tools. The first one is reserve requirements, how much the commercial banks are required to reserve of the demand deposits they receive, open market operations, and the discount rate, the bank rate, and all that. And I want you to be able to define what each of these concepts are at this stage. What is a reserve requirement? What is an open market operation? What is a discount rate? What is a bank rate? What is an interest rate? These things you need to be able to define. But what I want to talk about now is how the government uses these tools to influence the economy, and the government can do that through the impact it has on money supply. On the screen you can see the first point there is an increase or a decrease in taxation. An increase in taxation leads to a decrease in money supply. And if the government decides to decrease taxation, in other words, if they bring down the tax rate, that is going to increase the money supply or the money which people in the economy have. On the other hand, if the government decides to increase government expenditure, in other words, the government pumps money into the economy, this is going to increase money supply. People are going to have more money. And if the government decides to decrease government expenditure, this is also going to decrease money supply. The bank rate, the rate at which we can borrow from the commercial banks or the banks. If the bank rate is increased, this decreases money supply. And if the bank rate is decreased, we have more money supply. The same thing applies to the reserve ratio. It increases and decreases money supply. If it decreases, it also increases money supply. And this is the government's macroeconomic policy through the physical and monetary policy. So you need to be able to define what a monetary policy is, what is a physical policy, what are the two tools or the components of each policy, and how the government can use these tools to influence the economy, basically through money supply. Another concept is the concept of money. What do you need to know at this point? Definition of money, the characteristics of money, and the functions of money, as well as the history and evolution of money, talking about the trade by barter. Here I have some points as to what money should be. It must be an acceptable medium of exchange. It must be a legal payment for the settlement of debt. It must be a standard of value. We must be able to hold it. It must be a unit of account and a store of value. And inflation is a macroeconomic concept which we hear each time. It talks about the rise in the general price level of goods and services in an economy over a period of time. There are some types of inflation you're going to see in the text. There's the demand pull inflation or the cost push inflation. Demand pull inflation is when aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply. Demand is greater than supply. If the demand for a commodity is greater than supply, then the price goes up. Then we say there's an inflation in that situation. On the other hand, a cost push inflation is caused by increases in the prices of inputs. For example, labor, raw material. If the price to produce is very high, then the cost is transferred to the consumer. Then things become very expensive. That is cost push inflation. What is important also are the effects of inflation. What are the impacts inflation has on investment, on the interest rate, on the exchange rate, on unemployment? Then how do we control inflation? We can control inflation via those two tools, the monetary tools or the fiscal policy tools. Fiscal policy, government expenditure and taxation, like we saw in the red slide, or we can use the monetary tools such as the open market operation, the bank rates, the reserve requirement ratios, basically through the central bank and the commercial banks. Then we go through international trade. International trade is still part of the course outline, which has to do with the exchange of goods and services in this scenario across international borders or territories. Exchange of goods and services among nations of the world. What is interesting here is, why do nations trade? That's the question. Why do nations trade? In the theory, there are two basic reasons why nations trade. The first one is the comparative cost advantage, and the second one is absolute cost advantage. And you should be able to explain what these two advantages mean. As you can see on the slide, comparative cost advantage, when countries have differences in factor endowments. If country A is better endowed than country B, then country A can trade those goods with country B that doesn't have those commodities. On the other hand, an absolute cost advantage is when country A can produce and sell cheaper, better, faster than other competitors. Then we say that country has an absolute cost advantage in the production of that commodity, and as such is going to engage in international trade. And international trade, in other words, increasing exports to boost the country's GDP, which is very important. The last part of this course outline is the exchange rate mechanism. An exchange rate regime is the way a country manages its currency in relation to other currencies in foreign exchange market. How is the Namibian dollar related? How is it related to the US dollar, the British pound, the Japanese yen, and other currencies of the world? How does the country manage that currency? Now, an exchange rate could be floating. In other words, you allow it to fluctuate in response to the forces of the market. It could be pegged, allowed to fluctuate around a certain value, or it could be fixed, currency fixed against the value of another single currency. Those are the definitions you need to be conversant with. And you need to also know the advantages and disadvantages of the different exchange rate mechanisms, which is very important. What are the advantages if it's fixed, floating, or pegged? Yes. Now to the tutorial guide. List and explain. These are some of the concepts that are in your letter. When we say list and explain, you list the points and you explain them one after the other. Really differentiate the differences between them. Calculate, make sure you show your workings. Compare and contrast, make sure you do that. Don't forget to use diagrams to illustrate your write-up where necessary. And don't forget to define your concept. And finally, don't forget to include references in your work. That is the end of this session, and I wish you the best in the course.